Good news, everyone. I found the milk. Now we can finally get back to our regularly scheduled programming. Moving on from Asgard, let's talk about the women of the Captain America films, with Peggy Carter up first. Peggy was originally a tragic figure who represented the happy life that Steve could have had, but was forced to give up when he fell in the ice. Her charging the front lines in the first Avenger was pretty silly at times, but it was ultimately pretty harmless. Aside from that, her role in the story was fairly well handled and compelling, but since Marvel can't help themselves, we can't just leave well enough alone. Before we get into that, though, we should talk about the great niece Sharon Carter, because where Peggy represented what could have been, Sharon represented what could still be, and existed to say, even though you've lost everything, there is still a way to start over and find fulfillment in life. Sharon Carter was the lifeline that would have saved Steve Rogers from all the loss he'd suffered, and would make him feel at home again in the new era. At least, that would have been the ideal thing to happen, until the writers forgot about Sharon, and had Steve abandon her, alongside Bucky and all the other Avengers, in order to replace Peggy's first husband, and thoroughly jack up the timeline. Then Sharon would go on to have some bizarre pseudo-villain arc out of nowhere. The message here is to never move on and cling to the past, no matter how unobtainable it is, and no matter how many lives you will damage along the way. Great storytelling. Simply marvelous. No, ending the Steve Rogers story this way was a disaster of storytelling and never should have happened. But that's a topic for a separate video. Then, of course, there's the subject of Captain Carter, who is just a cringy waste of screen time that adds no value to the story except to say that Steve Rogers doesn't matter. What if this pure-hearted man wasn't able to inherit a power that would otherwise corrupt people with less refined morals? Well, it would have been fine, because Peggy could have done just as well of a job, if not better. Nah, let's stop this silliness. On top of it all, she just looks ridiculous.
Captain Carter.
A more compelling what-if story could say that Peggy took the serum since they were left with no other option, and with it she was able to do some good. However, the serum would ultimately corrupt her, as it would with most people, and would tragically lead her down a more villainous path over time. Personally, I find that to be a much more interesting story to tell. You know, instead of asking, what if someone else did everything Steve Rogers already did, but had boobs? Peggy Carter is a minor character. Her story finished a long time ago. Let's move on. Nobody watched her spin-off series, no one cares. Some of you might push back against me here by arguing that Captain Carter is a good addition to the overall story, because it gives Peggy more to do, and it adds an extra dimension to her character. I wouldn't say this is a good point, because too much of a good thing can be a bad thing. The original Peggy story concluded nicely, and added a profound layer of depth to the overall Captain America saga. But now with this Captain Carter business, there's this extra layer of mediocre sludge that we are forced to consider as a thing that exists. We now have to pretend that Peggy would have been this great legend if only Steve Rogers and the patriarchy didn't get in her way.
This is our only chance! Now!
Stark, don't do this!
This should go without saying, but she could have been remembered as a much better character if only they spared her of this goofiness. As the metaphor goes, the story is a puzzle and every character is a piece, and they all need to fit together nicely to make a great image. Peggy just so happens to be a small piece of the puzzle, and that's fine. There are plenty of other female characters with more important roles, which we will get to in a moment. When you quite literally enlarge Peggy's role, that just diminishes space for other characters and creates many problems within the story. If something already worked fine, then leave it alone, don't mess it up. Now, a good example of the opposite problem would be the movie portrayal of Maria Hill. Comic Hill's most notable story would be when she would take over Nick Fury's role as director of S.H.I.E.L.D. for a time, and while in that position, she would be a driving force behind the Superhero Registration Act, and was a major player in the Civil War storyline. A fairly villainous player at that. Movie Hill is barely noticeable outside the first Avengers film, and even there, her most story-relevant scenes were cut. Then when Civil War comes around, her role is reduced to atoms in favor of bringing in General Ross for some reason, despite the Hulk not even being involved in this story whatsoever. It's just baffling to me, because by the logic of Kevin and the heads of Marvel, it is bad that there are too many white men. So there is big talk about how we must diversify, yet they removed a female character from her previous position of power and gave her spot to an old white man. Hypocrites. And now there's not even a chance to redeem this character, because they gave her a quick, unceremonious, anticlimactic death in the Secret War show. Super cool. These actions tell me that not only do these people have bad ideas, they are also bad at executing them, and they have actually no idea what they are doing whatsoever with the property that they own. To nail down this point further, we should talk about the Wasp, probably one of the characters to get fumbled the hardest within the MCU. The Wasp used to be a major player in the Avengers lineup, being one of the most reoccurring members of the team, even leading the group for a time. It is embarrassing to see how forgettable and unremarkable she is in the movies. Marvel's writers seem to think that making a strong female character means stripping her of any personality and pushing her cool and unique powers into the background in favor of some gimmicky MMA moves that we've already seen from Black Widow. This character has 2 titular movies, while also being featured in several other films, and somehow has managed to come out of all of that being completely void of any relevance. Heck, there are even 2 Wasps, and that's still the case for both of them. It is astounding how bad they failed with this character. Cassie Lang is more memorable than Wasp. Yellow Jacket was more memorable than Wasp, even before he was MODOK. Her showing up in Endgame was a plot hole, because Doctor Strange wouldn't even know that she existed. Then when she's there, she doesn't even do anything except stand with the other women while waiting for applause simply for existing. Be it Kevin, the Russos, or whoever was responsible for this moment, they were so dumb that they didn't realize that they wouldn't have to manufacture a moment like this if they just followed the comics and made real characters, because the women there are far more developed and respectable. The fact that they flaunt this scene around is embarrassing, because they took previously complex and likable characters and just reduced them to their genders in the most shallow, forced display of girl power that you could possibly produce in this context. It's incredibly irritating. There's already a litany of tough, quippy, gun-shooty karate girls in this franchise. Wasp doesn't need to be amongst them. Her powers are to shrink, fly, and shoot lasers amongst other things. Those are very unique powers. Take advantage of that. Let her do things that no one else can do, and it's okay to give her a more playful, easygoing, innocent personality. Not everyone needs to be strong and independent. Let's have some emotional diversity for once. Also, Ant-Man and the Wasp are a duo, not a hero and his sidekick. You guys didn't need to give second billing to the Wasp. You changed the story to make it that way. It would have been a more interesting and unique dynamic if you just kept it how it used to be. Also, her costume is just weak. It looks like a yellow copy of Ant-Man for no reason. Wasp had dozens of costumes over the years to pick from, and plenty of them look great. Most of which don't even have helmets, so you gave her this goofy CGI one that you keep taking off for no reason. You could have spared yourselves the embarrassment of making that and just left her face exposed. Moving on, I'd like to touch on the Guardians of the Galaxy with Nebula and Gamora. These two were actually handled rather well, especially Nebula. They had solid multi-film arcs, good designs, and good roles within their stories. The only major complaints would be that they are much less powerful than their comic book counterparts, but that's not an issue exclusive to the females. The movie Guardians as a whole were portrayed to be rather weak. Gamora is someone who should be powerful enough to give a gauntlet-free Thanos a hard time. Plus, Nebula should have gotten to wield the gauntlet. That's the most significant thing her character ever does. Mantis is a similar case. She's less powerful, but the movies make her an entertaining and enjoyable character. Up next, we should talk about the Scarlet Witch. She will be an interesting character to break down, because this character has had a roller coaster of a journey throughout all her films. Starting from the top, she and Quicksilver had a rather out-of-place debut in Age of Ultron that caused the film to be overcrowded and disjointed. While there, she was given a lackluster accent that would eventually disappear.
That accent really comes and goes, doesn't it?
And a messy origin that would stray very far from the comics. For those who don't know, Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver are the children of Magneto, and many of their storylines are tied to this fact. So you can imagine how different these two would have to be changed in order to exist in a world without Magneto or any mutants whatsoever. It makes you wonder why Marvel even bothered to bring these two in at all. They could have introduced other Avengers that would have been much easier to work with, especially in a film like Age of Ultron, where these two really just don't fit, and all they end up doing here is causing the story to be bloated and messy.
Wait, guys!
Their origin is that they volunteered to be Tesseract experiments under Hydra, and that gave them their powers, with a later retcon implying that they always had their powers, but they were just dormant. But then she also gained new powers on top of her dormant powers, and she wasn't aware of those ones, and it's all a big mess. The twins starting out as villains before turning good mirrors their early comics where they started out as henchmen for Magneto before eventually turning on him. Only in the movies it's Ultron who they initially work for, which is strange because it's weird seeing Ultron try to make friends. friends, but that's a separate issue. Once she becomes an Avenger, Scarlet Witch's role on the team, powers, and romance with Vision are all fairly similar to the comics, only altered to fit the context of the film's storyline. The Civil War film used Scarlet Witch as the catalyst to kick off the movie's events, which didn't happen in the comics, but it still works, because she is a character who is known to struggle to keep her powers under control. In general, they did a fairly decent job with Scarlet Witch so far, in spite of all her radical changes. The main issue during this time is that they completely avoided giving her a costume for some reason, in favor of her just wearing basic black and red clothing. The real issues with Scarlet Witch emerged during the WandaVision era and beyond, as they just do a lot of goofy stuff with her story. In dealing with the losses of Vision and Quicksilver, Wanda seems to have a superpowered mental breakdown, in which she holds an entire town hostage and forces them to live out her fantasy of living in a sitcom with a fake copy of Vision as her husband. During this time, she gives birth to 2 fake children, who age 10 years in only a matter of days. The show's narrative will take a bizarre stance and say that Wanda is the misunderstood victim in this situation because she is forced to delete her fake family at the end.
Monica, she blasted you halfway across New Jersey.
And I survived because she chose to protect me.
She's holding thousands of people hostage.
And it could have been thousands more if she hadn't put up her own quarantine.
And the people that are trying to save the town will be portrayed as villainous because they use guns.
You've taken an entire town hostage.
Well, I'm not the one with the guns, Director.
And the townspeople will be portrayed as unapathetic and ignorant for wanting to be free from her torture.
They'll never know what you sacrificed for them.
This show sends a really dumb message. One that sends Wanda's character off the rails. The show also does this very annoying trend that many other MCU shows and movies do, where they will debut a classic costume, but they'll make it look really cheap and dumb as a joke. Wanda does get a proper costume eventually, but it's a little difficult to appreciate when the entire story surrounding it is absolutely bananas. Things get even worse when Multiverse of Madness comes around, as Wanda apparently became so attached to her fake children, whom she only had for a few days, that she is now willing to murder her way through the multiverse in order to acquire real copies of these children. She doesn't give a shit about Vision anymore for some reason, even though a duplicate of him was made and is out there somewhere.
I am Vision.
No, she just wants her fake kids back, but now they have to be real. They can't be fake anymore, and they can't come from a universe where they are already orphans in need of a mother. No, she must kill an alternate Wanda and many others in order to acquire them. Then when she realizes the error in her ways, she will pretend to kill herself in a shallow act of redemption that does not justify the cost of her evil in any way. So, they absolutely jumped the shark with Scarlet Witch at this point. Their best option now would be to leave this character dead and spare us from any more of this silliness. If they do bring her back, I would hope that she would stay as a villain at this point, unless they are willing to put her through tremendous amounts of work to try and redeem her, because she has done way too much damage to be welcomed back as a normal Avenger again. If not that, then they would likely bring in an alternate universe replacement for her, but a move like that would be cheap as hell and equally stupid. Actions need to have consequences, and if you choose to ignore those consequences, your story will quickly lose any meaning or value. That's a big reason why most modern Marvel films are failing, by the way. It's really a shame how poorly handled Scarlet Witch became, because she really is a fascinating character, and there is a way where putting her down a second villain arc could be really entertaining. And of course, we do have the comics to refer to in regards to what could have been. In the movies, this storyline was relegated to an interesting series that ended horribly, and a follow-up film that was significantly worse. Wanda got sad, went crazy, kidnapped a small town, suffered 0 consequences, went even crazier, killed and humiliated a bunch of people, then pretended to die. Beautiful story, right? Well, in the comics, this storyline was developed for literal years, spawning dozens of books, having several arcs, and was significant enough to affect pretty much every corner of Marvel's Earth, several times over. Spoiler warning for those who are interested in reading House of M, but to summarize, Wanda has the mutant power to warp reality, and she was steadily losing control of this power, and was struggling to determine what was real and not real in her life. This problem was steadily driving her mad as a result. The tipping point for this issue occurred when she tricked herself into thinking that she was pregnant and had children. Sound familiar? She desperately wanted her children to be real and couldn't accept that they weren't. And to remedy this problem, Wanda was taken in by Professor X and Doctor Strange, as they tried to help her separate fact from fiction in an effort to help her regain control over herself, though these efforts were unsuccessful. Eventually, Wanda's lack of control put the Avengers in severe danger and ended up costing the lives of Scott Lang, Hawkeye, and her husband Vision. So the remaining Avengers and X-Men had a meeting together to discuss if it was even safe to allow Wanda to continue living at this point. Most agreed that they should not give up on her, but not all of them. Her brother Quicksilver caught wind of this meeting, because he's still alive in the comics, and he schemed of ways to protect Wanda alongside Magneto. This scheming eventually led to Wanda warping the entire planet's reality in order to give everyone the best possible lives that they wanted in a world that was ruled by Magneto, and everyone was brainwashed to believe that this was always the way things were. However, a select few began to snap out of their mind control, and they fought to restore the world to how it used to be. This conflict escalated into a small war, one that resulted in the death of Quicksilver by Magneto's hand. This greatly disappointed Wanda, as she concluded that even when she gave everyone what they wanted, they still couldn't help but fight each other non-stop, especially Magneto. She also concluded that mutants at large were part of the problem, as her father was always motivated to fight in their name, and so she turned the world back to normal, but stripped 90% of mutants of their powers. Then she went into hiding for a long time and left the world the way it was. This story goes on, and there are many side stories and prelude stories that go along with it, with the point of bringing all this up being that there was way more depth, way more effort, and a far better execution placed into the House of M story in comparison to the rather lazy, slapped-together, politically motivated slop that we got in the films and the show. Wanda herself was never some unhinged psycho woman who committed horrible atrocities in the name of fake children. She always had good intentions, but simply lacked control. When she changed the world, it was to create a utopia for all, not just herself. There was even a lengthy discussion between the heroes over whether or not they should even stop Wanda in the first place, because this new world that she created actually was pretty nice, even if it wasn't real. Spider-Man in particular had an understandably really hard time with this. When that false world failed, Wanda erased mutants to put an end to the conflict, which, while that was still a problematic thing to do, is far more reasonable and understandable than rampaging across the multiverse in order to forcibly adopt some babies. It's also important to note that comic Wanda makes her way back eventually, and goes on several lengthy arcs to redeem herself after everything that happened. This doesn't completely undo the damage she has caused, as many horrible things happened as a result of her actions, but that is something her character has to wrestle with, and there are steps she can take to right her many wrongs. Meanwhile, it's heavily implied by her fake death that the movie Wanda is meant to redeem herself as well, but these writers made that a really hard thing to accomplish, considering they made her one of the most evil people to ever exist.
Why would you do that? Why would you do any of that?
WandaVision spends a significant portion of its runtime poking fun at the comics that it's based on, while failing to realize that said comics create a significantly better story by just about every metric. Comic Wanda is a good-intentioned, heroic person who is prone to stumbling down the wrong path due to the difficulty of wielding her overwhelming power. Movie Wanda was once a well-intentioned person who completely lost her sanity and committed all kinds of heinous acts, all while attempting to be portrayed as the victim. Many people may try to excuse Wanda's actions as her being under the influence of the Darkhold, and therefore she should not be held accountable for all that she's done. But there's a couple hiccups in that logic. For starters, she opened and read from that book of her own free will, while being fully aware of what it was. So she's still at fault, even if the book warped her mind. But also, while using the book, she was still apparently sentient enough to feel emotions and make decisions, to the point where seeing her fake children be afraid of her made her feel guilty enough to give up her evil pursuits. It didn't matter if the book was there or not. So TLDR, it's a weak excuse, and Marvel should spend more than 2 weeks writing their films. On the topic of magic and sorcery, now would be a good time to break down the women in Doctor Strange's life. Let's begin with the Ancient One, a once Asian male who was bizarrely casted to be played by Tilda Swinton for the sake of making the film more diverse. But that decision only resulted in controversy, as Marvel got accused of whitewashing their characters, because when you play the game of social politics, everybody loses. On paper, the Ancient One should be a respectable and interesting minor character, if only the wild casting choice wasn't too difficult to look past. It would seem that Marvel would later promote Wong to Sorcerer Supreme status in order to compensate for that blunder, but they're only making things more confusing confusing and nonsensical by placing so much importance on their diversity quota. Doctor Strange's love interest in this film is Christine Palmer, an incredibly basic character who would get completely abandoned for about 6 years, only to later show up in Doctor Strange's sequel. During such time, most audience members would completely forget who she was. But that wouldn't even matter, because her role in this film would be to leave Strange and force him to move on. This is a good time to reiterate the point that romance is basically non-existent in these movies. Betty Ross shows passionate love for Bruce Banner before vanishing forever and getting replaced by Black Widow in a relationship that leads to nothing except the Hulk getting slightly angrier than everyone else when she dies. Steve Rogers has to tragically leave Peggy Carter in the past before getting trapped in the ice. Then he finds new love in Sharon Carter for basically one film, before she gets forgotten about and Steve abandons her along with everybody else in order to randomly go back to Peggy and homewreck her previous marriage. Thor falls in love with Jane Foster until she abruptly exits the franchise, and we just hear vague references about how they're no longer together until she randomly shows back up to die. Tony Stark and Pepper Potts had the best developed romance of the bunch, but even she would sporadically exit and reappear from one film to the next, making it plainly obvious that the success of their marriage was entirely dependent on Gwyneth Paltrow's dedication to the franchise. After Iron Man 3, she pretty much stops existing for years and years until Endgame came around, and then she was suddenly another super duper Iron person that I guess just didn't feel like helping out during these past events. I could go on, but all of this to say that the modern writers have become hyper paranoid about making dynamic love interests that were more important than mere damsels in distress. But yet the effort to keep the love interest relevant seems to entirely disappear after 1 or 2 films, and the gaps in development of said relationships will last upwards of 5 or more years before any advancements are made. The foresight and pre-planning for the MCU is painfully lackluster, and most character relationships suffer greatly as a result. Towards the end of Multiverse of Madness, classic Doctor Strange love interest and partner in crime Clea suddenly appears, in one of the most underwhelming and confusing debuts to date. This clip felt like a deleted scene that accidentally got left in the film due to how horribly the effects look, and because of how it directly contradicted the other ending of the film that preceded it.
Not in the least.
Let's talk about the ladies in Spider-Man's life. Starting with Liz Allen. There actually isn't too much to complain about here. Comic Liz Allen was a minor love interest for Peter, and although her story is heavily altered, her movie counterpart fills a relatively similar role. She is an early love for Peter that ends tragically due to her villainous father, and failure is a staple of Spider-Man's story, so a failed relationship is a welcome plotline. Plus, there's plenty of room for her to return should the story call for it. Gwen Stacy is not present at all in these films, which should probably be considered a crime, as her death is one of the greatest tragedies in all of comics and deserves a proper adaptation. However, Gwen's character design seems to have been copied and pasted over the MCU's Betty Brant. What does this mean? Probably nothing good. Now, the MCU's version of MJ is a big can of worms to unpack and break down, as this MJ isn't really MJ at all. She isn't even called Mary Jane. She is Michelle Jones.
Miss Jones-Watson?
Jones, I don't go by Watson.
She does not look like Mary Jane, she does not behave like Mary Jane, nor does she resemble Mary Jane at all. If they wanted to create an original character to add to Spider-Man's ever-failing love life, then that would be perfectly fine. Go for it. However, they create problems with this situation when they insist on calling this girl MJ, and by doing that, there is an implication that the real, classic Mary Jane won't be showing up at all in the MCU, and that is just an unnecessarily dumb move to make, with no real benefit. Mary Jane is one of the most iconic love interests in comics, and she has a long and complex history full of great storylines worth adapting. To just throw that all away in order to give this strange goober a big name is a painfully huge waste of potential. These movies seem to be embracing the idea that they should be different from the norm on the grounds that they are from a different universe, and therefore things should change for the sake of standing out. This is a dumb approach to take, because the MCU is the first major long-form adaptation to exist for Marvel in the mainstream. To make major changes like that right out the gate just makes this universe seem like a cheap imitation, and audiences will have to look elsewhere if they want the true story. If there were ever a time to make the most comic-accurate adaptations possible, it should have been here in the MCU, when Marvel was first breaking into the mainstream and becoming a household name. Ideally, you want to set the standard and tell people what you are, before you start experimenting and making weird changes, but that's not what happened.
Spider-Man's name is Peter Parker.
What the